All right. So today we have Professor Uri Gneezy of UC San Diego. And more importantly for this podcast, he is the author of our 2023 Book of the Year, Mixed Signals, How Incentives Really Work. So Uri, welcome to the Data Exchange Podcast.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
So Mixed Signals is a fantastic book that explores the dynamics of incentives in various contexts. And for our audience, incentives here, we mean things that drive individuals and entities and organizations, which might include individuals, families, economies, companies, and even countries. And why should you folks care about incentives? Well, don't take it from me, take it from Sam Altman, co-founder and CEO of OpenAI, he recently wrote that incentives are superpowers, set them carefully. So with that, I hope that you pay attention to all the advice that Uri is about to share with us in this episode. So I'm going to structure, Uri, this conversation on some of my takeaways from the books and go from there. So first takeaway is there's a lot more to incentives than just monetary incentives. So there are incentives that go beyond financial incentives. So in your mind, what types of non-monetary incentives might be particularly effective or important for people who are building the types of things that people who listen to this podcast are building, software services, for example?
So for me, incentive is what I'm looking for in every interaction. When someone comes to help me with fixing the house, or when I hire someone, or when I come to your podcast, what is my incentive here? It's clear. I want to sell more books. I want to get the word spread. What is your incentive? You want to have an interesting podcast. You want to engage people. For you, getting more people listening to your podcast, that's an incentive. Even if you don't get paid for it, it's just pride. It's just you feel good. I have more people are interested. That is all incentives. Now, as I said, in order to understand how organization function, you need to understand the incentive that each agent in this process has, right? And it definitely not money. Money is an important one, but it's pride. It could be feeling of fulfillment. It could be love. It could be hate. It could be any sort of emotion. Anything that you can think about could be there. And before you understand why the people you're interacting with, what is their motivation, you will not be able to understand what they're going to do, try and predict it, and try and tailor your behavior to theirs.
So another important thing I took away from the book is the importance of clarity and clear communication in terms of conveying incentives and goals. So do you have any specific examples about how clear communication of incentives improve project management or just basically the product experience overall?
In general, I think that one of the most scarce commodity we have now is attention. It's very hard to get people attention. Even when you get their attention, they're busy doing other stuff. If what you're designing is not going to be simple, it's going to be very hard to get people to actually spend. So you can say, oh, if you only read the instructions for 2 minutes, you would know how to do it when you're releasing a product. And you're releasing it with very detailed instructions. But I'm not going to read 2 minutes of instructions. I'm just going to press some buttons. And if it doesn't work, I'm going to be upset and don't use the product. The same is true for incentives. If it's not clear and straightforward, it's going to be harder for the person that you're trying to incentivize to understand what you're doing, and then it's going to be less effective. So have a clear message that you understand what's the message. We're going to talk more probably about signals. What is it that you are telling the agent, the person you're talking with? What is it that you're communicating with your signal in a simple way that's crucial due to lack of attention, due to unintentional messages that you're sending if you're not simple and clear.
So Uri, do you have a favorite failure example in this regard?
In the book, I talk about a lot of them. I really love collecting them. One of the famous stories is from Hanoi in Vietnam. The French were there about 100 years ago, and they brought toilets with them, right? So facilities, that's great. With that came sewer, right? You need a sewer system, and with that came rats. Rats are not good, so they decided to try and eliminate them. They hired people to do it, but that didn't work. So then someone had a great idea. Let's pay people to kill the people, normal people, just kill rats and bring us the tail of the rat, and we'll give you, say, $1 per tail, right? So there was a poor guy at the city hall that just counted the number of tails that you got and paid accordingly. Well, the idea is good, but people suddenly started noticing that there are many rats without tails, so tailless rats running around the city because people just cut the tail and didn't kill the rat. They can have more babies. They start having rat farms, so to raise rats, and so on, right? So that's an example of incentive that, in principle, it was a good idea. In practice, it wasn't. And we're going to talk again more about this probably, but the biggest mistake over here is that the French governor, didn't anticipate the ability of people to gain the incentives, right? And for that, what you need to do is try and run what, think about it as A/B testing, some kind of an experiment in which you let people, you introduce these incentives. Can you see how people react? Right? In this case, you would see, well, tailless rats is not a good idea, and so on, right? So just check to make sure that what you intend is actually what happens.
So basically, any kind of incentive program, it's a good idea to start with pilots.
Whenever you can, absolutely.
Yeah. So the title of the book is Mixed Signals, which brings me to my next topic. So there are many challenges that you point out arising for conflicting or unclear incentives. So how can we avoid this? And how can we manage around avoiding mixed signals?
There are a few steps for this. The first is to understand that not all incentives are created equal, right? So if I just design incentive and I think that everything is going to be the same, that's not true. Different incentives are going to go to work differently. By the way, that's also true for companies that I work with, and they tell me, oh, we tried incentives and they didn't work. So for me, it's like saying that I went to, I don't know, Indonesian restaurant and the food was not good, so I conclude that Indonesian food is bad. Well, it could be that I went to a bad Indonesian restaurant, right? It's just, it doesn't mean that the food over there is bad. The same is true over here. Different incentives are going to have different impact, and understanding the signal that you're sending is really important. In one of my early studies, we ran an experiment, Aldo Rustokini and I ran an experiment in a daycare in Israel. So the parents were supposed to pick up their kids by 4 p.m. That was the case. And then at some point, the principal introduced a 10 shekel, which was about $3 fine for parents who came 10 minutes late. What the principal expected was that the number of kids that will show up will go down. But in reality, imagine yourself, you are, oh, I should be there on time, I should be there on time. Oh, it's only $3. There is a new information. The principal gave us new information. Before that, we didn't know how bad it is to be late. Now she's telling us it's only $3. Well, if it's only $3, I'm not going to drive like crazy and try and kill myself, right? I'm going to take my time, right? So we ran an experiment like this. We had a few weeks in which we just followed 10 daycares. Then we split them to 2 groups. In one of them, we introduced the $3 fine. In the others, we didn't. And what we found was that with this, according to this intuition, in line with this intuition, the daycares in which you had fine, parents were actually more likely to come late to pick up their kids. It's as if you got a license. You send a signal that it's okay to be late, which is not what the principal wanted. Now, if the fine was much bigger, so in France, there is a place where if you're late to pick up your kid, the principal takes the kid to the police station and you have to pick them up from there. That's a big, that's something that will deter people. But the fine was very small, so it didn't. Now, what was interesting also that after a few weeks of fine, we eliminated the fine. Now, if the reason that people came late was because, oh, it's like a babysitting service that I'm paying for, people would have been fine with that, but then would go back to normal, like they were before, after the removal of the fine. But what we saw was that even that the group that had fines, after we removed the fines, they kept coming late. So it wasn't, oh, I'm paying for this service, so it's okay. It was really the information. I didn't know how bad it is. Now I know that it's only $3 bad. I might as well. So you're sending a signal with your incentives, and you need to make sure that your signal is in line with what you actually want to talk about.
So it seems like that one thing that can help people, especially in the software space, is one, as you point out, right? So it's important to run pilots and experiments. So it seems like one of the main things that people might consider investing in is just this software infrastructure, so you can run experiments readily and you can measure what works, what doesn't, and then continuously tweak and improve over time. And certain companies have this software in place, and there are certain startups who are building software to make it easier for companies to run experiments, more like in demand, like an analyst or some marketing person can run an experiment and check. They can go to a dashboard and see everyone else who's running experiments, so that they're not colliding with each other's experiments. So it seems like experimentation software and an experimentation mindset is critical.
Absolutely. So exactly like you said, I work with few companies. I think that most of the big companies today have some unit that does this, that does some kind of A/B testing experiment. It could be from trivial things like the color of the background, and all the way to more psychologically based hypotheses that you want to test about what's going on. And sometimes you need software, sometimes you don't need, but I think it's crucial to use it. It's very hard to predict how people are going to react to what you're doing. I'm studying incentives for 30 years, devoted lots of thinking to it, lots of experience with it. Very often when I design incentives, the first time it doesn't work, we need to tweak them until they do. I'm surprised by the results very often.
Yeah, it seems like for listeners, if you want to kind of get good at incentives, you need to get good at running these experiments, and you need to kind of develop a culture where kind of data matters, and data is important in decision making, rather than having someone just opine about things without any basis.
Yes, absolutely. So it's an interesting point over here is that often managers think that they are hired in order to know. You should know what will happen. And what I'm trying to convince executives very often is that testing and learning from your clients, from the real people, doesn't mean that you're bad at your job, right? It's just a good practice to do. Don't assume that you know, and don't feel scared to say, well, I don't know what will happen, but I know how to test it. And that's also a very important thing to understand.
So, Uri, when it comes to experiments and understanding what incentives work and what don't, so where are you on the whole correlation versus causation? What should you try to understand?
It's really funny how even smart people don't understand the difference, right? So, for example, selection, they don't understand that you have something and you get different people that will go to it than in other situations. I have an example that I really like about if you go to a restaurant and you look who drinks Diet Coke versus who drinks Coke, you'll see that the fat people are actually drinking the Diet Coke. So someone who doesn't understand causation think that, oh, drinking Diet Coke will make you fat, right? So really understanding this is at the core of what we're doing. And that's why experiments are so important, because we have a control, right? So if you look at sales of ice cream, for example, and you don't have good control, you'll see differences that are due to, towards the summer, there are more ads and more sales of ice cream. And if you don't understand that this is correlational, you might think, oh, the ads are really contributing to the sales. But if you understand it, you can try and tease it out and see what's the net effect of ads and really price them correctly.
So the other thing you talk about is this notion of credible signaling, which is reliable communication and actions. So can you describe for our audience more precisely what you mean by credible signaling and why it's important?
So in general, for signal to be there are situations in which, you'll ask me, are you telling me the truth? I'll tell you the truth, right? Can I trust you? I'll tell you that you can trust me. But there are things that I can do in order to signal to you. One example that I like, that it's not an economic example, but I think it's really nice, is imagine that I'll decide that I want to spend the spring on my Harley Davidson and go around, and no one will confuse me with a real hardcore biker. Why? Because I can buy the bike, I can buy the jacket, I can buy the boots, but that's easy. That's very cheap signal. If you have the money, it's a cheap signal. When you see the real Harley with with neck tattoos, then that's a real signal. That's not, oh, I'm doing it in the spring of 2024 and then I'll go back to the office, right? Because if you want to be a financial advisor and you'll have a large neck tattoo, the clients will not like it, right? So that's a credible signal when it's something that is not temporary that everyone can buy, but it's something really, really deep. That's an example of something that is harder to fake, and that's why it's more meaningful.
And what are some practical implications of credible signaling? Why should people care about this notion, this distinction?
Right, because you want to be able to, if I want you to trust me, for example, so imagine that that I want you to do something, that I'm going to pay you $1,000 to do something for me, and then I'm telling you, but I'm going to audit you, and if you wouldn't do it correctly, I will take, say, $200 out of you. Then it becomes a game for you in which you try to think, oh, is it better for me to slack on the job and be paid only $800? On the other end, I can tell you, look, I trust you. I'm not going to check your work. I really trust you. Now, in terms of incentives, you have all the incentives not to do the job. But I signal to you that I really trust you. And if you care about the fact that I really trust you, that it's not some kind of bickering game, but I really trust you, you might be more open to actually do what you're supposed to, right? It changes the interaction.
By the way, so Uri, as you were talking there, it occurred to me, so is there a distinction between the term incentives and, several years ago, this term nudge became kind of fashionable. So
right, there is a big difference between them. Nudges, I'm not talking about nudges. Nudges are small changes that I can do to the environment, choice architectures, for example, the choices that you make. And usually they are very cheap to do, and they have small impact on behavior. Now, because they are cheap to do, it could be good to do them, but the impact itself is very small on behavior. That's what we know today. Incentives are real changes. Incentives is economics, right? That's what we are motivated by. So I think that's when you decide whether to drive or take a train, when you decide what to eat today, everything that you do involves prices and incentives that I think is a much more fundamental principle in economics.
By the way, as a casual observer of this space, it seems like a lot of the nudge papers have been withdrawn anyway.
Some of them, that's true. Some of them were withdrawn. In general, so imagine that you want to hire me, and I'll tell you, look, I can make these small differences, and there'll be small effects, but that's going to be efficient. Or I can tell you, I'll make small differences, and the entire world will change. I will switch the place of the bacon and the tomatoes on the breakfast buffet. So I put the tomatoes up front, and because of that, people will eat tomatoes instead of bacon, and obesity will disappear from the world. You would want that kind of guy that promises these kind of things. And much of the promises that came out of this were inflated.
Yeah.
We think that that was the reason that much of it didn't work.
So another thing you touch on is incentives also have unintended consequences, right? So
Right.
do you have some good go-to examples of unintended effects, and also, I guess, give us some kind of tips on how to avoid
Right.
falling
So
into
you
this trap?
can think about the message that you're sending alongside the incentive. So imagine that I'm telling you, you should work as a team. You should cooperate with your coworkers. It's really important. Your boss is telling you this. But then she is giving you incentives that are based on individual performance, right? Why would you work to help the group when your incentives are personal? So imagine that it's sales, right? So there is a new person coming and you need to onboard them, to mentor them, to help them get started. But then you will not make your own deals. So you won't do that, right? So the manager should decide whether she wants to encourage cooperation or encourage individual effort, or some kind of combination. But don't say cooperate and give incentives, individual incentives. That's not going to work. Another one is creativity. Most companies will tell you you need to be creative. Creativity is important. But then what does creativity mean? It means that you're increasing the variance. So there is higher chance of success or something really different and interesting, but there is also a chance of failure because you're trying something new. If you keep doing the same things, you're not going to fail, but you're also not going to have great success. Now, if the incentive is such that if you fail, I don't give you a raise, I don't promote you, I maybe even fire you, why would you try to engage in creativity? You'll keep doing the same stuff, right? So again, the message, so in some cases you can say, look, for doctors, I don't want them to be creative. I want them to follow the protocol. That's not the place where I want the doctor to have creativity. But for engineers that are doing R&D, for example, you might say, I don't want another, a small improvement over what we have now. I want the jump, right? I want the next step. And for that, if they fail, you need to tell them, look, failing is part of the process. Thank you for trying. Let's learn. So what happened? Why did it happen? How can we do it better in the future, right? And also, people will not chase the failure for too long, the losses, because they'll know to cut it faster. Another example is long-term versus short-term. Imagine that you're on the board and you hire a new CEO. You tell her that you care about the long-run success of the company, but then you evaluate her performance based on quarterly success. That's not. That's a conflict, and that's a mixed signal. Either you care about the long run, or you do this. So think about this CEO, for example. Is she really going to invest in new computer system, for example? Imagine that you need, I don't know, to upgrade the server. That's going to cost you a lot of money now, save you lots of money later on. Are you going to do it? Well, if I'm judged quarterly, I'm not going to do it. Same is true for my governor. I live in California. We need a train from San Diego to San Francisco. The train that we have takes like a week to get. But if you invest a lot of money now, it will divert a lot of resources to the train that could be used elsewhere. People will not be happy with him. He will not be reelected. In 20, 30 years down the line, someone else is going to cut the ribbon and get it. So this conflict between short and long term is important. What you need. So if I would have been on a board and I would have hired this CEO, I would have told that person, look, we care about the long run. That's why for 8 quarters, we are not going to have any discussion about performance. After that, we expect to see, or whatever the horizon is, right? So that's, so those are just few examples of how you tell your employees one thing, but you give them very different incentives.
So in machine learning and AI, right? So when you deploy a model, you might have certain predictions or certain opinions about how this model will behave. But when you deploy it in production, it meets real world data, then you see there's unintended consequences in behavior. So I imagine, so in the incentive world, right? So you can kind of anticipate consequences and things like that. But as you measure how your incentives are working out in the wild, maybe there's unintended consequences, which kind of argues for making sure you have this continuous evaluation and continuous measurement in place as well, right?
Yes, so that's good. That goes to the experimentation. The fact that you say that you got something and it worked, it doesn't mean that it's going to work in the long run. So for example, me, right? If you ask me now, do you want an ice cream? No, I don't want an ice cream. I'm trying to not eat too much. But ask me after lunch, maybe I'll want it, right? So different time would be different things. It rains outside or it doesn't rain outside. I just slept well or I didn't, right? So things that you cannot even put into your model. People are very hard to predict, right? So you need to keep testing. It could also be that people just learned how to game the system. Took them maybe a few days to figure out. So that's why the experimentation should be dynamic. So it's not like you try at the beginning, you find, okay, that works, I want to stay with it. You should keep on trying until you're sure that everything works, and then keep on experimenting with small portions to see that nothing has changed.
Yeah. It seems like because basically you are dealing with, let's say, mainly humans, so it's an adaptive, dynamic environment. There also might be macro or events
Yes.
that are completely outside of your design, right?
Yes.
I mean,
I'm from Israel. As such, it's not a good time now. I'm very worried about what's going on in Israel. I probably behave differently than I did 3 months ago. And that's very hard to put into your model, right? So people are influenced, like you said, by macro effects.
or I imagine the COVID shutdowns was complete
Yes.
shock, right?
Yeah.
Whatever incentive program you had in place, you threw out the window.
Yes.
Yeah. So what are some important ethical considerations in designing incentives? So in the AI and machine learning world, we talk about responsible AI and things like that. So I imagine there's an equivalent in the incentive world.
Yes. So there are a few of them. The first one is that think about education. You talk with educator, they tell you now, you want kids to study because of intrinsic motivation, because they want to do it, not because we pay them. And that's an interesting point. There are some issues with it. So in some cases, if I want you to learn how to read and write, and they'll pay you to do that, you're not going to stop doing this after that. But if I want to teach you to enjoy reading a book, that's much more complicated, right? So that's one branch of problems. Another one is, of course, that every incentives is a tool, just like AI is a tool, and I can use the tool for good things. I can get people to try stop smoking, for example, or exercise more. Or I can use the tool to get people addicted to cigarettes. Right? So it's the same tool.
That happened.
Exactly. It's the same tool. So it's really the ethics is not, the tool itself is not ethical or unethical. The same is true for AI, right? So you can have AI to fix problems in the world or to create problems in the world, right? It's a tool that you need to have ethical responsibility when you do it. And there are many situations, by the way, in which we understand that things are not the best in terms of incentives, but that's what we want. So imagine that, think about a single dad that is raising a kid, get fired from his job. Now, the best thing in terms of incentives for him, in order to motivate him to go back to work, is not to have to eliminate all the benefits, no health insurance. So his kid will not have health insurance. And then the father will be really anxious to go back to work, right? In terms of incentives, that's what you should do. In terms of ethical, I think that that's a horrible idea, right? A kid should be able to see a doctor no matter how much of a failure the father is in finding a new job, right? So it's really the case that incentive is something that you need to understand. You need to understand what will happen. And you can say, look, in some cases, the health of the kid or the mental health of the father in this case is more important to me than the incentive for him to go back to work. So I'm going to design incentives that will take this into consideration and not just the most efficient thing in terms of incentives.
So if I put you in a room with room full of corporate leaders, and your task is to give them a few concrete steps in order for them to get better at incentives. So we talked about, adopting an experimentation mindset, maybe investing in experimentation software. What other things can they do? Should they be hiring people who are good
Yes.
at designing experiments or
No.
no?
No, the one person that they should hire, they probably have them, is what I like to call a common sense officer. So every company has CEO, CFO, all the good stuff, CTO, all the good stuff. They don't have common sense officer. In many cases, just having someone with common sense, someone that will tell them, no, that's going to upset people. Don't do it this way. So think about, again, we talked about the Israel example. I'm sure that many of your listeners will know the presidents of the university with the congressional hearing.
Oh, yeah.
When they were asked about the genocide against Jews, and they said, well, it depends on the context.
Right.
That's an example where when they listened to the lawyers, and the lawyers told them, look, as presidents of the university, given free speech, there are some cases in which you need to react. But if they had common sense, they would say, look, of course we're against genocide. Everyone is against genocide, against Jews, against anyone, right? However, in legal terms, right? So if they had someone with common sense instead of lawyers that will tell them what's legal, what they should say, they would also have someone that will tell them, look, people are going to be upset if you say that genocide is okay depending on the context, right? Preface it by saying genocide is bad, no matter if it's against Muslims or Jews or anyone else, it's just wrong. That's my opinion. And the same is true for many other examples in which just having someone with common sense, don't listen just to the engineers. The engineers can solve a problem, but very often people will not follow it because the solution that they offer is not something that people will say, which if you get someone, random person from the supermarket where you go shopping, that person can tell you that, right? So there is something that is called curse of knowledge. In many cases, we know too much. So if I try to explain math to a first grade kid, I might find it problematic because I don't understand what he or she don't understand, right? And that's the importance is to have someone with common sense that can tell you, look, that's not how people are going to see it. You're going to do A, but the signal that people will see will be B.
Yeah, it seems like what you're describing in the common sense officer is someone who can basically get outside of the groupthink in some ways, right? So that happens in a lot of organizations.
Right.
So speaking of Israel, another example I have are those books, what is it, Startup Nation and the sequel to Startup Nation, right? So one of the things they talk about there is in the military in Israel, right? So privates can go talk directly to generals and tell them what they're doing wrong, right? So it seems like this kind of ability to just open up the conversation to a broader group.
So two comments about this. First of all, yes. So there is no respect for authority in the Israeli culture, right? So like you said, the private can go to the major and tell him, no, this is stupid.
Right.
But what's really interesting is going back to what happened. Still, Israel was surprised, talking about common sense. How come Israel was surprised on October 7th, given that everything was out, all the information was out there, and there were some low-rank people who said, look, this is going to happen, but people ignored them, right? So it's not that Israel is perfect in that respect, right? Israel really missed a very important, a common sense person that would look at that, would have said, look, Hamas is telling us that that's what they're going to do. They have the capabilities. Maybe we should think that that's the case. But I think that to a great extent in organization, if you can have someone that, so you have lots of discussion, you're already into this, you're thinking about the change that you want to make for months. You really don't see the picture like a normal person that with fresh eyes will look at it, right? If you solve a problem that you're sure that you solve it, but normal people will go back to attention that we talked about at the beginning, that will devote only 10 seconds to this, will not see it. then you did not solve the problem. Have someone that will be like your customers and see what they think about it, right? And that goes back also to experiments, right? To see whether your intuition, after thinking about it for so long, is right, or maybe you're just completely off because you thought about it too much.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's almost like in software, right? So you build a piece of software, you think it's perfect, but then most companies these days, they'll hire a security company to do penetration testing. In AI, they're starting to do things like red teaming, right? So it seems like in incentives, what you're saying is let's put the incentives in front of real people before we
Yes,
actually deploy it to production,
yes,
right? So,
yes. Don't be too smart, right? Don't be too smart. Be as smart as your clients in that respect, in what you're designing. Make sure that you understand the target audience and you address
yeah,
there.
yeah. And with that, thank you, Uri. And again, I can't say enough about this book, Mixed Signals. Make sure you get a copy if you're building any kind of software service. And like I said, don't take it from me, take it from Sam Altman, who basically, he said incentives are superpowers, set them carefully. And with that, thank you, Uri.
Thank you very much. It was a lot of fun.